Welcome to Cloud On Air, live webinars from Google Cloud. We are hosting webinars daily. You are watching From Engineer to Engineer, a show where you can hear from Googlers about how to solve complex problems on GCP based on stories from customers. My name is Som Roy. I lead the professional services team in San Francisco, and today we will be talking about accelerating GCP Foundation to support your enterprise workload. And joining me today is Ramsey. Ramsey, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, Ramsey Haddad. I'm an infrastructure cloud consultant, also based out of San Francisco.
You can ask questions anytime on the platform, and we have Googlers on standby to answer them. So let's get started. Today, in this webinar, we would be covering three things, which is an overview of GCP Foundation, which means what is GCP Foundations, and Ramsey will take us through that. We will talk about the best practices in getting GCP Foundation in place. And finally, we will learn about how Google Cloud Professional Services helps enterprise customers get a foundation set up on GCP. So with that in mind, Ramsey, should we get started?
Yeah, sounds good.
So the first thing that, Ramsey, we want to understand is what constitutes GCP Foundation, or when we say GCP Foundation, what does that mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So this question comes up quite a bit, and it's an important question, especially as our enterprise customers start their journey into GCP. You can think about your foundations as all of the actions needed to take you from getting your initial domain set up all the way through the ability to host a production-grade workload in GCP. What includes that, right, in your foundations is everything from getting your domain, your identity access management components, organizing your resource hierarchy in GCP, establishing some network connectivity, getting baseline monitoring in place, and also your billing.
Okay, that explains a lot. So, Ramsey, what are the must-do items here to make sure that, what are the must-do items which is in scope for foundation then? I mean, you talked about the 5 big blocks, but what would be the must-dos?
Yeah, what we really want to do is be able to set up a platform in GCP in order to run a sandbox workload, but do it in a very controlled and contained way. One of the things that we encourage our customers to do is establish these best practices for their foundations early on in their journey in a way that allows you to iterate and improve on them long term. An example of that is setting up a billing account. A lot of our customers will start potentially in an offline space and move into an invoiced platform where they'll take a billing account and they'll associate projects to that billing account. It's a pretty simple operation to do, and what we want to make sure is that we have an operating model around how we do billing upfront and early on.
Okay. And Ramsey, what would be a typical customer profile who needs to set up the GCP Foundation?
Yeah, so a lot of customers will kind of look at these best practices and think this is very much only for the enterprise space. This fits the enterprise space as well as solo developers and medium-sized businesses. In the enterprise world that we work in, a lot of customers will actually take a subset of these best practices, get them implemented, and then be able to mature those into supporting global workloads.
Okay. And Ramsey, the last question on here that I have is, obviously a lot of customers are new on the platform.
Yeah.
So what would be some of those Google Cloud Platform nuances that they need to be aware of while they are setting up GCP Foundations?
Yeah, I think the big thing that we see in the field is making a few key decisions around who's going to have access to what resources in the cloud early on, and feeling comfortable with that you're going to need to mature that over time, as well as the relationship between G Suite and GCP. One of the really cool things about Google Cloud is that we have the ability to provide directory services through G Suite, and we're able to sync users and groups from G Suite to GCP.
Okay, awesome. I think there's a lot to cover on that. So why don't we start off with our deep dive, and we will start with cloud identity. So Ramsey, take it on from here.
Yeah, sounds good. So similar to one of the questions you asked earlier, one of the starting points with getting into Google Cloud Platform is really understanding what your authentication path is. We have a lot of customers that are existing G Suite customers. And being an existing G Suite customer allows you to have an existing cloud identity profile already set up. Now, let's look at a scenario that isn't, if a customer is not a G Suite customer, we'll need to go through and actually get your cloud identity set up. That requires you to register a domain, so you can select @examplecompany.com. That would be the domain that you're going to use to host all of your GCP resources, and we'll get that set up in G Suite. That provides an admin function inside G Suite to essentially get into what we'll step into a little bit here, which is around how access permissions are governed in GCP.
Okay. And Ramsey, you talked a bit about customers who are on G Suite, and I'm assuming it's easier for them to start, setting up the foundations because they already have G Suite accounts. Can you also stress a little bit about customers who are not on G Suite and what would be their path to the foundations?
Yeah, so a lot of our customers are using similar services like Active Directory, and what path they typically take is they'll set up what's called Google Cloud Directory Sync. So they'll establish a directory in their on-prem environment, they'll create groups in their own Active Directory, and then they'll sync those groups with a set frequency into G Suite. It's a relatively easy utility tool to get set up, and our customers usually start with net new groups to be able to use GCP. We'll talk about why you want to kind of isolate existing corporate groups versus identity and access management groups.
Okay. So then there's a good path forward even if you are not on G Suite.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is actually a great segue into users and groups in Google Admin. So Google Admin has this concept of individual users and groups. So as we can sync individuals over to GCP, we can also create groups and add those users to those groups. The main thing that we want to consider here is that if we're governing access with a group, we can then terminate individual access without actually having to remove the group from GCP. So what we see a lot of customers do is they sync all individual users that are going to ultimately need access to Google Cloud, but they establish a set of groups for more kind of functional activities in the cloud.
Okay. And Ramsey, are there a set of basic groups that you should consider setting up when you do this exercise?
Similar to the kind of buckets of foundations we talked about, it's important to have a established cloud operating model and a set of groups to complement those functions, similar to, say, network administration at examplecompany.com or billing admins at examplecompany.com. So we'll recommend you to set up just a few groups that allow you to isolate the access permissions on specific resources in the cloud.
Okay, cool. Makes sense. Let's move on.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the kind of other unique aspects of GCP, and as a really starting point to set a solid foundation in the cloud, is understanding what your resource hierarchy is going to look like. And just to step through that a bit, resource hierarchy in GCP starts with an organization node. Your organization node is your domain, so at examplecompany.com would be at the highest level of the hierarchy. And then coming below that, we have folders. So folders are a way to group projects, and you can actually apply identity and access management permissions to those folders themselves. You can also create a subfolder as well, so somewhat of a directory type function. And then we're coming down to projects. So projects, for those that are not aware, are essentially the trust boundary for all your resources that are isolated in the cloud. This is a resource container for all of the policies that you apply to your projects.
And I'm assuming you are going to take us through an example now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So let's go into the example here. At the highest level, we have an organization. So this is actually mapped back to a customer's domain. And then going into the folders, which is a really unique part of Google Cloud. And it's great because you can organize all of your resources either by department or by function. We've seen a lot of customers organize their parent folder level based on their business need or based on some type of DevOps or engineering requirements. Coming underneath that, we have projects that are mapped directly to those folders by a specific function, and then resources that ultimately live in those projects. Something important to note here is that we really recommend, as you go through this organization resource hierarchy, that you start to set some best practices around naming conventions and standards for how you actually build services in this construct.
Okay. And Ramsey, I'm assuming every customer is different, and we have seen many different iterations of this setup. Would you talk about any typical examples on how customers usually set up their resource groups? Like, is it by environment, workloads, or even business units?
Yeah, so what we've seen a lot in the enterprise space is creating a parent folder level by environment. And the reason why we see this kind of most common in the enterprise space is that it allows for resource isolation and for you as a user to apply access permissions at the folder level without having to individually isolate resources. Setting up the folder structure by environment also allows you to essentially carve out other folder structures for more common or shared components. So an example of that is we've seen customers have a folder specific to their network, and they're able to have multiple network projects in that folder. So everything from non-production shared VPC host project, non-production shared VPC service projects, as well as having a separate folder for common services such as billing or logging and monitoring tools.
Okay. And I'm assuming, Ramsey, how we set this up also has downstream impact on how billing is done. So can you talk about a little bit on how this will impact billing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned naming conventions previously. Naming conventions are a great way to indicate what lives inside specific resources in the cloud, but it's not necessarily a billing construct. So what we want to be able to do is create a logical resource hierarchy here by folder, by project, and then also look at billing labels. And I'll go into what billing labels are here shortly, but ultimately billing labels are a key and value pair. And we see a lot of customers use these to help kind of understand what costs are living in specific projects and resources. Billing labels can be applied both at the project level and at the resource level. So what we've seen customers do is come up with a standard set of labels that they want to apply at the project level. Example would be, cost center and then the cost center number, the department and then the department or business unit, and then we'd actually apply those to the projects themselves.
Okay, that makes sense. So then I think that's a good segue to kind of deep dive more into the IAM space now around the setting up your foundation.
Yeah, this is a very important area and something that will ultimately have to become part of your cloud operating model and mature as users start to gain additional access and new workloads start to come into the cloud. But establishing principles on identity and access management is very important up front. And so identity and access management allows you to adopt security principles at least privilege that you can grant either at the user or resource level. So we want to understand ultimately what the use cases are, what groups need to interact with the specific components in the cloud, and then we want to start to then refine our access permissions to govern that. And here's an example of what cloud identity and access management might look like. So we have the users, groups, and service accounts that will be interacting with the resources in the cloud. And then we have these roles. So in GCP, we have primitive roles such as project owner, project editor. But what we really want to do is start to break those down over time to understand what are the exact policies that the user needs in order to perform X function. So we want to come and build these custom identity and access management roles and then apply those to specific groups.
So you mentioned groups and individuals. So can you kind of deep dive a little bit on what that means, groups versus individuals, and what is the benefit of groups over individuals?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of level set, the individuals are nested inside of a group. So for example, if SOM at examplecompany.com is applied to a project and SOM leaves example company as his employer, then the user permissions then get revoked. But if we do that at the group level, it's not removing individual users per group. We just remove the access at the directory level, and that propagates all the way through. We want to be able to elevate the functions by using groups and not necessarily individuals. So we want to be able to take that and then make it a lot easier for us to govern access permissions and then put an entire lifecycle around that.
Okay, and that is how we should mitigate the risk in terms of if we use groups and if somebody leaves or somebody changes department, that way, it's not affected or we don't have to go back and update it individual by individual.
Absolutely, and then it also removes the operational overhead of managing individual access at the project or folder level. We can just apply a group and then manage the individuals within that group at the source.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Billing, it's a fun topic.
Everybody's favorite topic.
Yeah. So billing is something really important to harden in the best practices early on in your journey to GCP. And at a high level, there's two different kind of paths to take with billing. So we have offline, which is an invoice billing account, and then we have an online account, which is actually based on a consumer credit card. The differences between the two is that an offline account, you have to have an organization node, which is the best practice to take if you're going to be setting up folders and your overall resource hierarchy. And then online is basically consumer accounts using a credit card. One of the most important things to do here is actually kind of think about what user permissions you'd like to apply here, and then how many billing accounts you'd like to create. We recommend creating one billing account if you're using an org node and applying that at the highest level. Just to talk a little bit about billing accounts and projects and how you associate all of that. Billing accounts are a way to map all of your usage in the cloud to a central cost control. And what we do is actually, when we create a project, we have to associate it to a billing account. In order for you to associate it to that billing account, you need to have access to it. Going back to having a baseline set of access groups, we really recommend having billing admins and understanding what user permissions are going to be had at the billing account level and establishing that practice early on.
So Ramsey, if somebody wants to see their billing data in a dashboard and not within the console itself where engineers have access. So for example, let's say I'm on the procurement side, I'm really only concerned with the financial part of it. How would they go about seeing that data and what can they do?
Yeah, there's a few different paths you can take. Inside the billing console, there are billing reports where you can look at the overall usage based on projects that are created underneath that org. As well as we have a lot of customers wanting to get deeper insights into their billing models. So they're actually going through and exporting their billing data into BigQuery and then creating Data Studio's dashboards on top of that. So there's a variety of ways that you can access billing data in GCP, but it really comes down to the company's culture and how transparent they want to be on their consumption. A few examples around that. Some customers want to provide full transparency to their developer community on how much is being spent per project. So what they do is create access permissions and view permissions in the billing console to allow all users to see their project level spend. A few other customers that we've worked with have actually pushed out all of the billing data into BigQuery and created custom dashboards per business unit so they can ultimately see what's being spent based on their business unit or workload use case.
Okay, so there's a couple of options in how we can see that. And Ramsey, are there any, because we are talking a lot about best practices, are there any best practices around cost controls for billing account?
Yeah, there's a lot of things in the billing space that can be ingested early on. I talked a little bit about projects, and projects are a great place to insert a lot of your best practices, including billing. So we want to make sure that as we create projects, especially in a large organization, that we're always associating those projects to the right billing account all the time, every time. There's a few different options that you can do that, so you can make sure there's consistency between applying projects to billing accounts. We have something that I'll talk about in a little bit called the Project Factory, which builds projects in a very predictable and consistent way, including making sure that as you spin up a project, it gets associated to the one or many billing accounts that you end up creating.
Cool, awesome.
Yeah, so resource monitoring. So another key component of getting your foundation set up is that you want to be able to understand what is being used and how it's being consumed outside of a billing construct, but across all your different environments. Google Cloud native monitoring and logging tool, it's called Stackdriver, and there's a few sessions that you can check out to learn more about Stackdriver. But we want to be able to set up a sandbox Stackdriver workspace and start to really get into the practice of associating our projects to those monitoring accounts.
And this will give you the insight with what's happening, and it will give you several metrics across all your environment. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And including things like the network availability, understanding kind of agent-based controls. We want to start this practice early on and make sure that it's part of our entry point into GCP. Networking, connectivity, it's really important.
Last but not the least, right?
Exactly, connectivity is really important. So what we really want to do is make sure that there's some baseline connectivity in place. We typically recommend if you are going to use a shared VPC, you have a host and service project set up and start to really think about regions and what subnets you ultimately want to use. And going back to the access permissions, who should have access to this network? So a lot of our customers start out by setting up a foundational group, let's call it network admins, and that network admin group will have access to do certain things in the networking stack, such as create subnets, provide connectivity path, also change firewall rules.
And I can now clearly see how, when you talked about cloud identity, how that is tied back downstream when it comes to now setting up your network, because all the access control that you set up before is kind of related to that when you are starting to set up your network as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Connectivity options. So there's a variety of different ways that customers can get connected into GCP. Everything from direct peering to carrier peering, public internet / VPN, and dedicated interconnects. We really encourage our customers to think about this early on, as the process can take some time, depending on what the connectivity path is. But ultimately, we want to sit down and actually review all the different options, and then start to think about kind of what the long-term connectivity path and options are going to be. Great. So as we talked about foundations some and all the best practices around them, I wanted to share a little bit about what we call the Cloud Foundation Toolkit, which is a really cool project inside of professional services where we've committed to building out reusable modules in infrastructure as code to help our customers get their foundation set up. As you can see here at the bottom of the Foundation Toolkit project, we have tooling. So Google is committed to open source, as well as we want you as customers to be able to use whatever tool works best for your organization. We've authored templates in Terraform as well as Google Cloud Deployment Manager. As we go up the stack, we've kind of built a perspective on foundational modules that should be in place. I mentioned a little bit about the Project Factory, which is a really cool module that helps you spin up your project in a very consistent, predictable way. Everything to a module in Terraform and Deployment Manager on how you would ultimately govern your networks and access permissions. The Foundations Toolkit project has built a ton of really cool resources. As you can see, everything spanning from cloud storage to Forseti to Spinnaker, and encourage everyone to take a look at it. If you all check out cloud.google.com/foundation-toolkit, there's a GitHub open source repository of tools for you to check out, both in Deployment Manager and in Terraform.
So if our viewers want to go down to that Go link, they should to that link that you shared. They should be able to access that code that's there and all the templates that you guys have already started.
Yep, absolutely. And just know that there's a team within Google that's dedicated to building out these templates, as well as working with the various infrastructure as code tools to be able to update the provider to support GCP.
Cool. Awesome. That's pretty cool. All right. So Ramsey explained a lot about, how to set up GCP foundations. He also talked about the open source project that we have around Cloud Foundation Toolkit. So within the Cloud Professional Services. So we wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about what is Google Cloud Professional Service and what we do on a day-to-day basis. So our mission is to help our customers and partners get the most out of Google products. PSO is responsible for customer success through best practices, advisory, training, as well as developing a partner ecosystem to support our customers at scale. Ramsey, we see this on the field every day. This would be good to kind of share with the viewers that how does PSO work and how does we help, we talked about foundation, we help customers set up foundations on a day-to-day basis. So we do this in 5 different ways. We bring dedicated Google expertise to solve business challenges. We recommend solutions based on proven methodologies and best practices. Like what Ramsey covered today is the best practices around setting up foundation. So that is how PSO would kind of work with our customers. We work alongside our customer with hands-on advisory as needed, and we equip the customer team to take on challenges and through training and certification. And last but not the least, PSO is also responsible for kind of making sure our partner ecosystem can also deliver value.
Yeah.
So that's all about PSO, and Ramsey touched upon all the elements of GCP Foundation. So today we wanted to wrap up with, the summary of what we discussed. Get your GCP Foundation right. I think Ramsey covered all the key elements there on what it means for GCP Foundation, what are the different components, and how you can kind of work through each one of them to build a strong foundation. Um, Ramsey, the first point here is start early. I think that you
Yeah.
kind of stretched upon that few times. Like we really need to, customers need to start thinking about foundation early on in their life cycle. Do you want to kind of talk
Yeah,
about the
absolutely.
importance of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And by starting early doesn't mean everything has to be in place, but there are just a few fundamental things that we touched on today that should be accounted for early on. What we've seen customers be really successful with is actually building out what's called a cloud center of excellence or a central cloud operating model that helps establish these best practices and mature those over time. So the earlier you can start that, kind of the better you can wrap around maturing that over time.
Cool. Awesome. Then the other thing that we wanted to stress upon is, work through all elements of foundation. That we talked about cloud identity, we talked about billing, we talked about monitoring, and we also talked about networking. So when we say foundation, it constitutes of all these different pillars. So make sure that you work through all the elements, because as you saw in our webinar today, they are all linked to each other, and you have to get every step right to make sure that your foundation is set up. The other point is, make the foundation future-proof. By that, what we mean is, if you get the foundation right, it makes it much easier for you to scale up on the platform. I am sure, Ramsey, you have seen many customers who start off with the foundation, put some time on getting the foundations right, and then later on, 6 months down the line, they are able to scale up on the platform much easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea there is that we want to be able to establish the foundation and then bring it into automation, right? The idea behind the Foundation Toolkit project is that we wanted to provide codified best practices. So the sooner we start to think about resource hierarchy, access permissions, billing, we can then bring that all into automation and then distribute that over time.
Okay, awesome. And then, I think that's a good segue on the fourth point is follow the best practices and leverage the Google Cloud Foundation Toolkit. Ramsey and team has been putting in a lot of effort to build that open source toolkit for our customers to leverage. And it definitely covers all the best practices that we typically would suggest to a customer. And if you need any help, Google PSO is always there to help you set up your foundations. So that brings us to the end of our webinar today. Thank you for joining us. Please visit Cloud On Air for more content from Google Cloud experts. Thank you again, and bye-bye from us.